Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar series that we produce. Mongabay is excited to provide resources, tools, and answer questions about environmental news topics for journalists and audiences interested in learning more about these issues. So today's webinar is going to be focused on reforestation. And this practice is becoming more abundant as nations across the world address the simultaneous crises of biodiversity loss, climate change, water scarcity, and others. So we're going to be talking about reforestation projects, how to cover them, their efficacy, transparency, and other environmental and human rights implications. Additionally, we're going to have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of this webinar to answer any questions that you all have. But first, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists here, starting with Robin Chazon. So Robin is Professor Emerita in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Department at the University of Connecticut, and part-time research professor with the Tropical Forests and People Research Center, Forest Research Institute at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. Her research focuses on forest regeneration, forest and landscape restoration, and ecosystem services provided by forests. She's the author or co-author of over 215 peer-reviewed publications, including her sole-authored book, Second Growth, The Promise of Tropical Forest Regeneration in an Age of Deforestation. Robin, thank you so much for joining us. Feel free to say hi.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining.
And next we have Erin Axelrod. Erin is the project director for Jonas Philanthropies, Trees for Climate Health, which is a campaign to grow 10 million trees by 2025. She is an expert on nature-based climate solutions, especially tree growing, and presents regularly on the benefits trees have on our environment and communities. Erin, it's great to have you.
It's so great to be here. Thank you for hosting this.
Absolutely. And lastly, but not least, we have Nithin Coca joining us. He is an Asia-focused freelance journalist who covers climate, environment, and supply chains across the region. And he has been awarded fellowships from the Solutions Journalism Network, the Pulitzer Center, and the International Center for Journalists. He has been featured in Financial Times, Mongabay, NCIA, Yale E360, China Dialogue, The Nation, and Engadget. Nithin, thank you so much for being here. How are you?
Great to be here and looking forward to discussion and learning from the other panelists as well.
Great. And I am your host and moderator, Mike DiGirolamo, Audience Engagement Associate for Mongabay.com, where our team regularly covers reforestation projects, science, trends, and techniques. So if you want to do paid reporting for us on this topic after today's discussion, visit the opportunities section at our nonprofit sister site, mongabay.org. So I'm going to give panelists a couple of minutes to answer each question that we pose. And towards the end of this hour, we'll give you all time to have your questions answered. So please note that this entire webinar will be uploaded and published to our YouTube channel for your reference, along with links to any resources that are shared in the chat room. So now that we've got the introductions settled, let's go ahead and get into it. Starting with a question that may sound obvious, but it's very important. What is reforestation? And just as importantly, what isn't reforestation? Please feel free to share your biggest key thoughts that journalists should keep in mind.
Well, I think I'll take that one first. Reforestation is a generalized term for reestablishing tree cover on a piece of land that previously was forested. So that's why it's a reforestation. But it can take many different forms. So what that tree cover is, it could be plantation. It could be a monoculture plantation or a mixed species plantation, exotic species, native species. It could be agroforestry, or it could be natural forest regrowth that is just coming back on its own after deforestation, which we call natural regeneration. And that umbrella term has led to a lot of vagueness of when people say they're doing reforestation, because it can mean many different things. And it's important to note that technically this applies to an area that was previously forested. So it's reestablishing trees within a forest biome, within a forest ecosystem. So reforestation is not technically the same thing as planting trees in a non-tree ecosystem like a grassland or a savanna. That would be called afforestation.
Thanks, Robin. And I'll just add that it goes without saying, but protecting trees first is obviously a very critical component to counteract climate change. And so when we're talking about reforestation, that would be a separate and additive component of protecting our climate. But it also is important to note that not every program is effective. There are reforestation projects that can have adverse impacts. And so, a very critical component of any reforestation is really evaluating, is it the right tree? Is it in the right place? And is the planting done by the right community? And that's really how we evaluate reforestation programs. I would also like to sort of push us to think about, should we really qualify monocultures as reforestation? Because I think the idea of reforestation is really looking at an ecosystem in the further successional phase of a forest, and this idea of longevity. And I just question whether monocultures can achieve that type of longevity, and whereas community engagement, appropriate species diversity, to really create this resilient forest that's going to be increasingly able to withstand natural disasters and such. Those are the things I would add.
Yeah, and I just want to, bring up the fact that the concept of forest and reforestation are very political, contested terms. There's a lot of interests who want to designate particular land as forest, and I've seen cases in Indonesia and Japan. I think also it happens in the U.S. where businesses or governments want to declare monoculture plantations as forests in accounting, so they can receive carbon credits, so they can get certain designations, or so that their businesses can look like you're doing something positive for the environment when actually they're not. So I would just say don't trust, figure out what a forest is. To me, I agree with what the speaker, with Erin and Robin said, like it's really about ecosystems. It's about what trees as part of like a living, breathing, active system, not necessarily just the trees. So anytime something focuses too much on the trees and not about what the trees are actually doing in a system, I think that's problematic. And lastly, forestry is a very big business. We often think of forests as natural environment. We don't really realize that there's gigantic amounts of money flowing into forests around the world, and that these business interests have their own kind of desires for what they want to do with public lands and private lands around the world. So forestry, forest, reforestation, these are all contested, overlapping, and politically charged terms. And as journalists, especially, you need to make sure we're digging into what these terms actually mean and who is defining them, and what are the goals of particular reforestation projects, because they vary greatly around the world.
Great. Thank you all for answering that question. So let's talk a bit about reforestation projects. How big are the reforestation projects that are typically being heard about, such as Trillion Trees? And what is the feasibility of a project of that scale?
Well, some of the individual projects are really quite large, and they're often, the size of them is, the targets are measured in terms of the number of trees that they intend to plant, rather than the outcomes or the hectares or the actual services that are going to come from that planting. But the biggest one that I know about is called the 10 billion tree tsunami program in Pakistan. And they've already planted their billionth tree very recently. They had a little celebration about that. So they still have 9 billion trees to go by 2023. Well, that's next year. And yeah, I think that in a sense, this is a bit of a contest among groups and countries to sort of reach the highest target goal. But I'm not sure that should be the right metric to use with reforestation or with restoration.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about this. And on our website, we actually have a 26-page primer where we accounted for a number of these reforestation projects. It is a bit of a paradox because while we need widely ambitious restoration goals, we absolutely need to do them in a way that is grassroots, place-based, and rooted in local communities. And I worry that some of the larger ones are not that. I also think, and I'll give you an example of a reforestation project that is about 117 acres. This is in so-called Alabama unceded Muskogee territory in the US. It's a project called Iginyi-Filigic. And they are reforesting an area that has been clear cut and doing it in indigenous ways with silvopasture and incorporating animal husbandry. It's a really beautiful example of a reforestation project that's an outgrowth of community-based self-determination. And I think this is a really important piece that when you go and look at our primer and how we talk about some of these large-scale tree plantings, we'll miss out on that level of community engagement. And I agree absolutely with Robin that gross number of trees is certainly not the best or only indicator of success in achieving goals related to climate change mitigation and human and planetary health. I think we must really forward the field of multifunctional tree planting for food security, community health, social justice, and that should be the forefronted goal rather than just a quantity of trees planted. Pass to Nithin. I'm sure you have more to say about that.
Yeah, I'm deeply skeptical when I get a press release or something from an organization that's talking about the number of trees they're planting in a particular place. To me, the number of trees doesn't tell me much. What I'm interested in is like, what kind of, are they using native species in the projects? And if they are using native species, where are they sourcing those species from? Are they involving communities in the planting process? What are the native species doing? What kind of science do they have to kind of understand the potential impacts? I'm also curious, like what other metrics they're using. I just got a press release the other day that made a claim that each tree they're planting in a project in India provides $200 in value. And I'm curious, like, where are they getting this figure from? What is this $200? Who's gaining this $200? And I think it's a big challenge because, you know, from a certain perspective, the number of trees is the most clear, easily understood metric. So it's something that we can point to. We understand what that means. Versus the actual other metrics we really want to understand, such as ecosystem services, such as how much is going back to its like really original state, is really hard to quantify, and it varies based on ecosystem and geography. You can't have a one-size-fits-all number. So the hard answer is you have to really kind of, journalists especially, you really have to like go and kind of explore and kind of really understand the specific details of each specific project to understand its efficacy. And I think republishing the number of trees or just focusing on the number of trees is doing a disservice to readers because it's not giving them the context that they need to understand what is reforestation and what makes a reforestation project beneficial for the environment and for local communities.
Great. Thank you all for answering that. And just to clarify, folks, we are going to definitely talk about like things like efficacy and transparency a little bit further down the line here. Our next question, though, is what are some of the biggest emerging stories surrounding reforestation that journalists should be looking out for and thinking about covering?
Well, I would say, and there has been quite a lot of articles coming out, which is wonderful. I think it's really important to highlight kind of the implications of focusing tree planting solely on climate mitigation and carbon storage and very quick carbon storage goals, which are often designed to support carbon offsets, and the compromises that activity has for many things, so many social and environmental issues. The more that we can talk about the nuances of tree planting and the complex outcomes and the impacts on biodiversity, on water supplies, on local livelihoods, on sort of local ownership and participation and engagement, the more I think people will understand and maybe ask more questions about programs that are based on tree planting. I also think that the biodiversity crisis is not getting as much attention as it should be, and that it really is completely linked with the climate crisis, and all the more reason to combine these multiple objectives when thinking about reforestation.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. The myopic focus on carbon is potentially implicated in land grabs and continued clear cutting of indigenous lands. I look to Rights and Resources as a great nonprofit that has a lot of resources around this threat to cultural survival. In addition to what Robin shared, I would say another interesting piece would be the leadership of women and girls in reforestation and land stewardship. I think that's a really interesting and compelling aspect of the media. Daughters for Earth is a campaign led by the One Earth Foundation, which I'm an advisor to. Another issue of concern would be farmers committing suicide in places like India because of climate change. And we just funded, or Jonas Philanthropies, the Trees for Climate Health initiative, just funded an initiative called Sankalp Taru that is funding a reforestation project to mitigate farmer suicide, because the crops that were traditionally grown in those regions are so at risk now because of changes in climate. So that's an important issue. Wetlands and mangrove forests disappearing, I think, is another issue of concern that journalists should be covering way more of. And lastly, I'll just say, this may seem out of scope for reforestation coverage, but reducing carbon footprint, transforming personal lifestyle habits, I think often gets lost when there's a non-nuanced, non-discerning messaging around plant a tree for Earth Day, when in reality, most people have much more agency over the amount of carbon emissions that their lifestyle habits are contributing to, at least if you're speaking to a US-based or an affluent country-based audience who are obviously contributing the lion's share to the climate emergency.
Yeah, and I just want to add one thing that I'm watching right now that I'm deeply concerned about. So right now, wood prices, timber prices around the world are really, really high. And the war in Europe, it may make things a lot worse. Russia is a major wood exporter. And if those supply chains get off, there's going to be increased pressure on forests around the world. And that's going to be driving more incentives potentially for clear cutting, more incentives into doing these monoculture plantation style expansion in order to meet desire for timber for construction and paper and garments as well. So we're at an interesting point, and I'm curious to see how the balance for reforestation for climate and ecosystem benefits is going to be. Is it going to be able to compete with this growing, desire for wood for private purposes? And it's a very it's an interesting time, and I'm unsure how it's going to happen, but I think it's something you should keep in mind, that there is a very strong growing financial incentive to exploit forests around the world, and that could have an impact on reforestation efforts as well.
Great. Thank you all for sharing all those very insightful answers. So you actually sort of shared some of these already, but what are some of the largest human rights implications or impacts of reforestation or reforestation projects?
Erin, would you like to take that one first?
Sure, I'm happy to. I mean, I'm tempted to go into the outsized benefits around potential co-benefits of reforestation projects when they're done well or right, and just share some more examples. I mean, for example, with regards to women and girls and the risks associated with increasing vulnerability to natural climate disasters, as an example. One of the things we're really excited about is projects that are specifically engaging women and girls leadership. We have been in touch, and Jonas Philanthropies has funded a project in Haiti with an organization, Despre Haiti, which has these women's led self-help group that reforest with moringa tree, which is an incredibly nutritious food crop, and really brings food sovereignty, economic security to these women's self-help group. So I would say one really great human interest benefit that can be engaged through reforestation projects is empowerment of women and girls and food sovereignty and economic self-determination. I already shared the one around mitigating farmer suicides, which in this region in India, there have been 15,000 farmer suicides just in the past 5 years. So it's an incredibly underreported issue, but one that can be mitigated if farmers can see that they can have economic livelihoods through more diversified cropping systems, which are also more resilient to climate disasters and natural disasters. And then, of course, I really think if the lens was more turned to stopping land grabs of Indigenous peoples and really looking to the leadership of Indigenous peoples as the ones with the historical ability to protect and steward land bases, that would have so many other outsized benefits in terms of just the respect and cultural recognition that these Indigenous people who've been fighting for so long should have in our world and in our culture. So I think that's a co-benefit as well if we actually effectively cover their stories. And I'm really curious to hear what Nithin says.
Yeah, this is an area I've wanted to look into more, but I haven't. But I think it's especially in tropical countries, land rights is always a contested issue. So like you mentioned, indigenous lands rights. There's in Indonesia, for example, there's still ongoing court cases about giving land back to indigenous peoples, and at the same time, a lot of that land that should be in the hands of indigenous people is being given to private companies, including timber plantations. So there is very often like I guess a question I would always ask is if when there's a reforestation project going on, like whose land is this and who's controlling the land, and is the local community being involved? It's probably something you wouldn't necessarily see advertised in the project, but it's probably it should be a question that you should always ask. And I think as reforestation efforts go around the world, I think the human rights implications are going to become a lot more clear and a lot more. They're going to require more investigating, more reporting on, because I think right now they're being deeply underreported and deeply undercovered. And part of the problem is because of the pandemic, it's been challenging to travel to some of these places. And actually, it's hard to sometimes understand how local communities are being impacted unless you can go there and speak with local communities, and especially indigenous people. It's very difficult to replicate that through remote reporting. That's been so. I'm hoping with time, as we can get back into the field more, and we can kind of connect the dots between what's going on and how local communities are being impacted.
Yeah, I would echo the remarks that Erin and Nithin have already made, and yeah, in my mind, the largest issue affecting human rights is the land grabs and the displacement of not only Indigenous people, but any kind of marginalized population that are sort of undesirable from the point of view of the government are pushed off the land, and they lose their food security and water security. They lose livelihoods, and there are no provisions in many cases for where they will go. And this is not a sustainable in any reason. And this kind of activity should be stopped, and there should be accountability for it.
Great. And so my next question piggybacks off of this. Then what criteria then determines project efficacy? And included in this, feel free to mention best practices that you think journalists should be looking out for.
Yeah, this has been a topic of a lot of discussion and articles actually over the last couple of years. So there's actually plenty of information out there about good practices for reforestation, coming from a mix of experts and practitioners and really knowledgeable people who think very broadly. In fact, there was an article published in 2020 called "The 10 Golden Rules for Reforestation," to optimize carbon sequestration, biodiversity recovery, and livelihood benefits, which is an open access paper. And that included authors from Kew Botanical Gardens who work in many parts of the world. And so there are many strategies that can be used that engage local communities, that utilize indigenous knowledge, that deliver a diverse range of forest products and services, that build on public and private interest, and that really are grounded in local communities, as Erin emphasized before. So this should become the new normal for reforestation.
I can just chime in. We follow a lot of those best practices. The Jonas Trees for Climate Health is looking at, do these projects promote food security? Do they engage and support frontline communities? What is the percentage of Black and Indigenous leadership? What's the type of effort? What is the survival rate, obviously, and cost per tree? But we actually discount the cost per tree, because it doesn't always indicate longevity of tree species. But I'd like to give just a few examples of, some of the ways in which these reforestation initiatives, because I actually think sharing the stories is a really important part of this media, because oftentimes I'll see experts talk about all the best practices, but then where in the world are these projects actually happening is very important to us. So for example, Aliados is an initiative that the Trees for Climate Health has funded, which partners with communities in Ecuador and Amazon to restore forests in biodiversity hotspots that are actually threatened from deforestation from oil, mining, cattle ranching, and monocrop agriculture, using an agroforestry technique. So hitting a number of those things that I shared as important priorities. Another example would be the Loma Katsi restoration project here in the US, in so-called US, which is led by a multicultural workforce of Latinx, tribal, and Euro-American crew members. And they're doing restoration in riparian areas, so looking at hydrology benefits, looking at workforce development, looking at fire resilience and restoration. So those are just a couple examples of, I think, projects that really exemplify those types of criteria that then would determine a project's efficacy.
Great. And I would just want to add, I think one mistake I often see reporters make, and something I made myself when I was getting into covering forest, is kind of not realizing that different ecosystems are really, really different, and what works in one ecosystem doesn't necessarily work in another ecosystem. So that means how you do reforestation and how you measure it is going to be really different. And I like to bring up one example of a project I really liked, but also kind of demonstrate some of the challenges of determining project efficacy. So I reported on this project run by this nonprofit called Health and Harmony in central Kalimantan and the island of Borneo in Indonesia. They call it reforestation. And they've been working with local community members to plant, I believe, 100 native species. And they kind of determined, I don't think necessarily scientifically, but more experimentally, if we put that many species, we can kind of bring in enough biodiversity so other species will follow. And they've tested that and they found that it did work for this particular forest. Doesn't mean it would work in another forest or another ecosystem, because it really varies. And then over, I think, about several years, they've been trying to measure things such as how many wildlife sightings are local community members seeing in these places. How does it compare to the number of wildlife sightings previously? They set up cameras and try to understand that how many native species that we didn't plant are showing up on the reforestation site, so they can see if it's actually bringing in more biodiversity through natural means. And those things are, they're very, very specific to this particular location, but they're trying to figure out ways to quantify this. They're also looking at ways to quantify the carbon impact, because they realize that's important for global measurements, but they're really looking at biodiversity first, because that's what's really important to the local community and to their to them. So in this example of a project, that one thing I've liked about talking with them, I haven't been able to visit because of travel restrictions, is that they're really transparent and they're willing to share the data. They're willing to talk about the problems and the challenges. And to me, that's a good sign that they're really trying to do something well. If they're just trying to point at certain figures that sound good, but without actually like going to the details and challenges, that to me is a bit of a red flag that there's maybe more hiding in the details that we don't know about. So transparency is really important. Understanding the really important local context and the local ecosystem and what works in that particular ecosystem, and that landscape is really important.
Fantastic answers, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next question, which actually piggybacks off of what Nithin just mentioned. And that is, what are some of the biggest challenges that journalists face when covering reforestation? And what are some ways to address those challenges?
Well, yeah, I think one of the issues is that for a particular project that's being the topic of an article, it's important to really interview a lot of different people and not just the implementers or the company or the organization that is doing it, because they may give you a very restricted view of their view of what they're doing, sort of the company line, so to speak. And they may gloss over some of the problems they've had or issues. So it's really important to get the input from other people who are on the ground and have observed, some of the practices and know the communities involved and know to what extent, their input was incorporated. And I think it's important to not just kind of get a standard forestry-based assessment of the status of the project, but include ecologists, other scientists, and local people in getting that information.
Nithin, do you want to share next?
Yeah, I guess one of the challenges I face is that when you visit a project or when you hear about a particular project, you're just seeing the project at this particular point in time. And you're trying to write a story that talks about how the project may look in the future, but also like you want to kind of understand like what was this landscape or this area like in the past, so I guess one of the challenges is trying to get information that can kind of build that timeline to understand both the past, the present, and the future of this particular area. There are tools that can help. There's a lot of satellite imagery databases which you can go back in time and see what a landscape looked like. There are also I think it's important to talk to people around there and try to get their understanding of like how things have changed or how they witnessed reforestation. One of the earliest reforestation stories I did was about reforestation in Japan. So Japan after World War II, during World War II, they had massive deforestation because there were just massive energy shortages. So a lot of trees were cut down for energy needs during the war. And then right after the war, they went on this massive reforestation campaign to replant. It ended up replanting, I think, 40% of the country's forests within like a 10 or 15-year period. This was in the 1950s and 60s, so it's actually quite early. I was able to meet, when I went to this village, one, I think, 85-year-old man who actually participated in those reforestation campaigns in the 50s. So he was really able to visualize what it was like, what the forest landscape looked like back then. There was very few photos from that time. Able to talk about how this was done, take me out to the forest and show me the trees he planted, and that was just really, really powerful to help understand what had happened and what it was like at that time. So finding those types of people can help bring some character and narrative and kind of understanding to the story, and to understanding what this landscape means for the people around it, because that's an integral part of any place in the world. There's no place in the world, very few places in the world, that people are not intimately connected with, and ignoring people is also kind of, in my opinion, as a journalist, ignoring the people and focusing only on the landscape is in some ways ignoring the landscape, because people are part of the landscapes everywhere.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And the only thing I would add, I think that's a challenge for journalists, is to be able to capture the attention of your audience without diluting the message or making it seem, covering it with a lack of nuance or discernment, because these systems are really complex. So, there obviously has been a lot of media that has kind of invisibilized complexities by making pretty strong claims one way or the other that trees are going to save the planet, or and so I think covering that nuance is a really incredibly daunting task that I'm in awe of all the attendees on this call that are trying to cover it and cover it well. And thank you for that service.
Great. Thank you all so much. So the next question I have is going back to project efficacy and best practices. How is this tracked, and how is the transparency of an organization's project evaluated?
Usually that depends on who financed the project, because they're the ones that get the report that verifies what they've done with the money, and especially if there's going to be another request for more funding. So the funding agencies have reporting requirements, and those have really kind of been the framework for what kind of information is gathered. And a lot of that is really not relevant. It may be a measure of the effort that they put in, or but not the outcomes of what they've done. In some cases, the time frame is way too short to evaluate some of these impacts, except for how many trees were planted, and that's pretty much all they could say in the first year. That's all they did. So there's an issue with regard to the requirements that projects have, of their funders to provide this. That is, we need to move outside of that project mentality, I think, to really assess some of these other impacts, which may involve, some independent verification or certification programs, or other kinds of ways of checking on what's been going on, especially if for projects that are being used for things like carbon offsets. So there's a lot of effort now to improve this monitoring information and to develop better indicators that are really providing information about the outcomes and impacts.
Yeah, and I could speak to how the Jonas Philanthropies Trees for Climate Health initiative does tracking. I will say that there is a tension. Nithin, you spoke to it in being able to fly and actually visit these communities. I think there's that same tension when we look at tracking. From Jonas Philanthropies' perspective, we were really trying to achieve a balance, a pretty balanced attempt at getting the level of rigor required to be able to really effectively monitor and evaluate, but also making sure that most of the resources actually go into the hands of communities. So we're not spending a lot of money having an advisor from a country far away go on flights to visit, et cetera, and those costs add up. And so we use both qualitative and quantitative tracking, and we actually allow the projects to choose which tier of verification and reporting that they would like to do. Some of them are just fixed point picture monitoring, simple as that, just taking a picture of the tree in many different seasons to see how it's growing and sending that to us. Some of them are a little bit more elaborate and taking diameter at breast height per tree. But I will say, our program does not involve site visits. It doesn't involve any on-site monitoring. And we did that intentionally so that most of the resources can actually go into the hands of the people who need the resources the most to do the work. And we're really leveraging trust-based, rapport-based connectivity with these projects rather than overly bureaucratic overhead costs.
Great. Yeah, I don't think I have anything insightful to add. I learned a lot from both of Erin and Robin on this, so thank you.
No worries. So with the next question, so recently here at Mongabay, we covered news of this giant corporate net zero reforestation project in the Republic of Congo. It turned out to be an acacia plantation, which would eventually produce timber. It was for the French oil giant Total Energies. So what are some red flags that journalists or donors of reforestation projects look out for when evaluating, financial or reforestation boondoggles like this one?
Well, I think that there's a huge need for developing more of a corporate accountability standard that would be held in which corporations would be held to account. I know that I work with 1t.org, which is a group working with the World Economic Forum, and they mostly work with corporations. They have a corporate alliance on restoration, and they have already come up with a set of criteria for reforestation projects with those groups that includes transparency and learning, integrity, using ecologically and socially responsible approaches, taking the right kind of action, and committing to leadership among the corporate world. So the idea is, once these corporations, and there are, I believe, 15 members, some of the largest corporations in the world are on this alliance, they would sort of take the leadership to encourage other corporations to follow suit and to sort of join in this. And I think that's a really good approach to building that culture of accountability within the corporate world, because the really committed corporations to these ideals are really the best ones to recruit more corporations to follow suit.
Nithin, do you want to go next? I'll share after.
Sure. Yeah, it just reminded me, like, when before I became a journalist, I was an intern for Biodiversity Foundation in Indonesia, and they would often have companies come up to them and be like, "Hey, we want to do a photo op by this mangrove plantation or by this reforestation. Can we plant 10 trees and bring our CE out there and take a photo?" And I think those kind of things are still happening, where a lot of companies, especially corporate sponsors and CSR programs, they want a good photo op of a reforestation project, but they don't want to invest the time and details into the time and money and kind of like, the long-term relationship building to make a reforestation project actually work. So for me, anytime a company is involved, it's a red flag. I hate to say that, but it's I have pretty low trust that there are corporations that really believe, really understand kind of how difficult it is to do these types of projects well. So anytime there's a company funding it, I want to kind of go into that and kind of understand why they're funding this. Are they looking for a photo op? Are they actually building like a long-term relationship? How long is their funding partnership for? And then other things, I think for journalists, like taking like a basic investigative approach to these stories is important. So dig into records to kind of figure out where the money is coming from. Look into the project details. How are they defining forests? What are their metrics? Are third-party certifiers involved? So groups like Forest Stewardship Council and Sustainable Forestry Initiative are increasingly starting to also work on reforestation. So I think it'd be interesting to look at how are they utilizing those third-party nonprofit standards, and how are those standards being implemented? And yeah, I guess really try to like dig into, do they understand like the fact that building long-term relationships really matters, and do they have a long-term plan? Are they going to be there when in 5 or 10 years, when there's a problem, when something isn't working well, when there's a community conflict? Are they still going to be there? Or are they going to leave whenever there's an impact challenge? Or are they only going to be there for a short amount of time? So yeah, I hope things have gotten better since then. That was like 10 years ago that I had that experience, but I have a feeling things probably have not in a lot of places.
I couldn't agree more with you, Nithin. Thank you for bringing that up. I would also include, carbon offset to me as a red flag, because there is the potential for that being a land grab on Indigenous. The other red flags I would look out for would be, a lack of representation from the local community, or a lack of diverse representation from the local community, from Indigenous communities thereabout, from BIPOC, from women. Monocrop, any sort of claim about a silver bullet tree species that's going to solve the region's problems would be something I would look for. And then I also wanted to bring in this what Robin mentioned much earlier in this discussion around natural regeneration and natural recruitment. A lot of these, a lot of the projects that are kind of having a nuanced community-based approach to reforestation are using the term tree growing as opposed to tree planting, because it encompasses such a wider array of tools in the toolbox to affect that recruitment. And lastly, I will just say, you know, when the Jonas Philanthropies Initiative launched, it launched with a world-renowned advisory board, and so we really leaned into the advisors to evaluate the projects that were being funded. And we've even had some of our advisory board members have, going back to the corporate comment, some of our advisory board members have raised that as a red flag. If reforestation projects have too many corporate sponsors, they've said, I wonder about how those corporate sponsors are having outsized impact on the project. And so, not to say that we've not funded because of that, but I will just say from our world-renowned advisory board, that has been a red flag for them as well. So, thank you.
All right, thank you all for answering that. So, actually touching upon something that Robin mentioned earlier, what's the impact potential or the efficacy of afforestation versus reforestation? And please go ahead and if you want to state what the difference is, again, just for those who are joining late, please go ahead and expound on that.
Sure. Whereas reforestation is establishing tree cover in a previously forested ecosystem, afforestation is establishing tree cover in an ecosystem where there were little or no tree cover. Now, that could be because it matters a lot why there wasn't tree cover. So if it's been like over 25, 30 years since there was any forest there, that could be considered, but it is a forest ecosystem, that could be considered afforestation. This is the FAO, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization's way of defining it. But if there weren't trees there because it is not a tree ecosystem, it could be a wetland ecosystem with grasses and sedges, or it could be a grassland ecosystem or a savanna ecosystem with very low tree cover. Afforestation can actually be very damaging to the ecosystem, particularly planting fast-growing, water-guzzling trees that really disrupt the hydrology of the ecosystem and affect water flows that then have deleterious effects on agriculture, on urban water supplies. So that is a really important issue in drier or very seasonal environments, which tend to have low tree cover to begin with. Planting trees is almost always going to have a negative impact on the water supplies. And that affects the entire ecosystem. And there are direct effects as well on the native biodiversity that simply don't live in that kind of. They required the grassland types of ecosystems for their existence. So I think from a biodiversity perspective, as well as the whole water cycle perspective, afforestation has to really be justified for reasons and researched in a way that to show that it isn't going to be having those bad effects.
I think that was a pretty comprehensive answer from Robin. I would just add again, this community self-determination is another component of evaluating whether afforestation or reforestation is plausible in a given bioregion. From my standpoint, I'm sitting in an office far away from these reforestation projects, and so I'm not going to kind of evaluate afforestation versus reforestation. If a community, especially a marginalized frontline community that is directly dealing with the firsthand implications of climate effects and natural disasters, if they say afforestation is needed to meet food security demands, to meet quality of life, to increase biodiversity for the right reasons, I'm going to lean into the trust that they know what is most needed for their community. So that would be what I would add.
Yeah, I don't think I'm not so familiar with afforestation, but it just what Robin said reminded me of like how in Indonesia these monoculture plantations built on peatlands, which is a wetland ecosystem, have had really negative impacts on fires, carbon emissions. So it just made me remember. It just made me think about how, yeah, these are all interconnected and different ecosystems. Yeah, understanding the science and understanding the ecosystem is really important. And I would not have thought of that as an afforestation effort, but I guess I can see it as an example of a negative effect of planting trees in a place, planting certain species of trees in a place they shouldn't have been planted.
All right. In the interest of time, we've got 2 more questions before we begin our audience Q&A. So really quick, we did speak with Professor Karen Hull from UC Santa Cruz on a recent Mongabay podcast about natural regeneration of forests versus tree planting. Can you quickly share your thoughts about letting forests regenerate on their own via natural reforestation? And I know you sort of already did this, but feel free to go ahead and just share some final thoughts on that.
I would love to, because this is my passion. As a scientist, I've been studying natural regeneration for over 30 years. So I'm trying to understand the process, and later realized how important it was for restoration. In many situations, the conditions are very good for natural regeneration, but that is not universally the case. So it's a very localized, context-dependent process. But even if there are obstacles to that, there are ways of enhancing and assisting natural regeneration that can overcome some of those barriers. And it is by far the most effective form of restoration for protecting biodiversity, and for above ground long-term above ground carbon storage, and below ground carbon storage as well. There's a huge potential globally for this. It has been underappreciated. We're now beginning to get a much more nuanced understanding of this, looking at the past and finding large areas that have regenerated naturally around the world, many in small patches, but there's a lot of them. And many of these areas are highly vulnerable to being recleared because they're not protected, or even if they are protected, people don't take that too seriously because they just think it's trashy, weedy kind of vegetation. But if you let that continue growing, you find all kinds of trees in it, and birds and bats and other insects, and it just begins to become a forest. But it takes time, and sometimes it needs a little help.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk about this. And I love that, Robin, you've made it your passion to learn about this and cover it. And actually, I'm kind of laughing because I have an example of a project we funded that is a regeneration of acacia trees, which is the one, Mike, you mentioned around the story you just covered. That's a terrible place to put acacia trees. However, acacia trees also have a lot of ecosystem benefits. So we've actually funded a project, the Fair Tree project in Samburu, Kenya, which is farmer managed natural regeneration, which is directly employing people to help allow these trees to recruit, which provides fodder, it provides shade, it changes the hydrology. And again, these farmers that have limited other avenues for employment and livelihood generation are able to get reciprocity to be able to support carbon sequestration and all these biodiversity effects of fencing out those areas and allowing that tree to recruit naturally while still having animals and other benefits in that region.
Yeah, it's something I really want to learn more about. Is natural regeneration, because it sounds like it has a lot of potential, and it's nice to hear something that could be a really good solution. I just, one thing maybe this is like kind of a red flag. I always imagine people are always part of forests everywhere, especially in the tropics, but I think also in other places around the world. So as long as natural regeneration is including people, which I think both of you have both mentioned as being really important, I think you can never exclude those communities and that are been there for a long time, especially indigenous peoples. And I think we have to remember conservation has had a worrying history of ignoring people and displacing people from their land to declare national parks, to declare national forests, and not realizing that those people are part of those forests and those communities, and they're the ones that actually help protect and keep it in its certain shape, because forests and people co-generate. So I think we just always remember, but people are a part of all these processes, and we can never ignore the role they're playing, even if they're playing it without us directly being involved or directly noticing it. They probably are playing a role that we just aren't seeing or aren't maybe valuing, because sometimes these indigenous practices, we don't value them in the same way scientifically as we do other types of practices.
Great, thank you so much. So here's our final question before we get to audience Q&A. And some of you are already sharing links here, but what are some organizations or sources of information that people can go to for more information about reforestation and efficacy of projects? One that I will share up front is that Mongabay does have a reforestation tracker, and I'll make sure to post a link to that into the chat.
Well, just to say, this is a really active area right now, including many scientists who've become engaged, as well as people working within NGOs and realizing, whoa, we really need to develop some tools for monitoring and frameworks for tracking projects. And not only using remote sensing, but using a lot of other on the ground information. We need better guidelines. And some of this can be used to support verification and certification, and some of it is just for adaptive management of projects and keeping track or reporting to their funders. So the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration is also actively engaged in this, and they have a whole unit, a task force that's working on monitoring based at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. So they're very actively planning tools for monitoring, mostly at country level. But the Restore platform, RESTOR, I can put the link. They're also monitoring at the project level and providing remote sensing, high resolution remote sensing data for projects, so they can at least at that level keep track of the progress. And there's also a global restoration observatory that is starting out. And they have been working on developing shared indicators that projects can use, so that they're all they're trying to align to the extent possible the kind of information they're gathering, so that they can have a database of information from multiple projects and learn from each other as well. I can put some of those links up there.
Yeah, I put a link into the initiative that we helped advise on and co-developed with the funder. It's called Jonas Philanthropies Trees for Climate Health, and in it you can click on different links and you can see all the projects that have been funded. You can see the advisory board that is advising on the project. You can also read a 26-page downloadable PDF primer on the approach, and I think there's a few other resources there. A webinar with Eric Tonesmeyer. I would also, say there's a number of organizations that I look to and trust for learning more about this. Tree Sisters is one of them. They have a number of really amazing projects that they highlight on their website. I'm really interested in following the Great Green Wall in Africa and Evergreening the Earth campaign. And then in the US, Trees, Water, and People is an amazing organization that does a lot of reforestation, and they even have I believe 4 companies that want to get involved in a carbon offset, which I don't always recommend, but if you are going to do that, Trees, Water, and People will be able to use those funds to do the community-based reforestation that they do. And then I just want to mention also with regards to mangroves, I know Mongabay has covered the Mangrove Action Project, but I really appreciate Mangrove Action Project there. Mangroves as a community-based ecological mangrove restoration, which I think is particularly unique in the mangrove space. And as we're seeing more and more media come out around blue carbon, having good places to go to for vetted scientific community-based research on mangroves, I would recommend Mangrove Action Project.
I'll just add, one thing that's really exciting for me that didn't exist even a few years ago is that there's a lot of scientific research taking place. One of the challenges as a journalist is that a lot of the best research, they don't publicize it very well. So you have to kind of be on the look for it. Eureka Alert, I'll put a link to it, is a really great tool to see what's going on in the scientific world. I saw I'll send a link to an article, but I just saw this really great study that came out a few weeks ago that compared restoration projects in 6 different countries, and they was looking at restoration, including ones that had taken place several decades ago, and kind of how the fact that they didn't use native species impacted both biodiversity, ecosystem services, and also potentially their climate impact. I'll share a link to that. The Global Landscapes Forum, they hold events in Africa and Asia, and also right before the climate conference every year, is a really great forum to, it has a lot of great scientific research and international collaborations on things like peatlands, landscape restoration efforts, and I think it's a really great event and a great forum to kind of get into the science a bit behind a lot of this. And another event worth keeping in mind for other journalists is that the World Forestry Conference is taking place in Korea at the beginning of May. A lot of it's going to be virtual, and that it's going to be the first, I think, conference they've held in about 2 years. And it'd be interesting to see just to know what the discussion is in that sector will be really interesting. I think there'll be a lot of, and it'd be a good place just to kind of get an idea of like what kind of projects, what the discussion is about. And I plan to attend. I think they'll find some interesting potential stories, good and bad there. I'll paste the links as well in the chat right now.
And I just wanted to piggyback off of what the World Forestry Congress in Seoul, which is, I believe, what you're referring to, Nithin. Before that takes place, C4 will be holding a seminar, an online seminar, around building a green, healthy, and resilient future with forests, and that's going to take place from April 28th through the 29th. So look at C4 for more information. That is the Center for International Forestry Research. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and open this up now to the audience. There's quite a lot of questions here, so we will try to get to as many of them as we can. We may not do so, but I'm going to go ahead and start with the top. This is from an anonymous attendee. Just a basic forestry science question: is the Miyawaki forest technique truly as effective as it sounds?
I'm not terribly familiar with this, except that I know it's used for more urban type of settings and very small land areas. So I think as certainly not for a large scale type of restoration approach, but a more targeted, perhaps urban or suburban setting, it could be very appropriate.
So I could speak to this. We have funded a Miyawaki method. The name's not coming to me right now, the project that we funded, but essentially the Miyawaki method is it's essentially starts with these tree islands that then ideally would catalyze natural regeneration by seeding these tree islands and then having them, allowing them to spread through natural processes, such as attracting birds that disperse seeds, creating biodiversity hubs. And so I am very interested in it. I think there's a lot of potential, but there's not as much examples of it as other projects. So I think we'll just wait and see. And we did fund one project that we're excited about observing over time through our verification and monitoring protocol.
Nithin, do you have anything to share?
No, go ahead. Let's go to the next question.
Okay, so the next question here, before I get to this, is a two-part. First, could you all share where people can follow you or find additional interviews or maybe media kits, your websites, and so forth?
Yeah, I could do that, or you could just Google Robin Chazon and you'll see a lot of that stuff coming up. But I could put, I do have a LinkedIn, and I have a Twitter feed, but that's with Partners RCN. I can put that also in the chat.
And I already added the website. The Jonas Philanthropies website is really the best place to learn about the particular to reforestation, because I also do a lot of other pieces of economic transformation. Yeah, so that would be the best place to find more about reforestation.
Yeah, I'll add my links in the chat, but I'm the only Nithin Coca I know of in the world, so I should be easy to find. Okay,
so the second part to this question, this person here says that they would like to hear a bit about your practice regarding long-form journalism on these topics and the possibilities for some degree of partnering with media and academic organizations, as well as community dialogue in engagement journalism and learning projects that have several media and engagement products.
I guess that's something. I know Mongabay has a reforestation project. I would love to see a platform like Mongabay perhaps like play a role to be able to bring more long-form journalism together from different communities and different places, because I think it's starting to change, but I think a lot of the journalism is done on a country-by-country basis and focuses on specific projects, like the reporting I've done in Japan or Indonesia. And I think there's a great need for more cross-country sharing of knowledge, sharing of reporting practices. And I think this webinar is a great first step towards being able to foster more of that type of, hopefully, collaborative journalism. And I think doing more engagement with communities is really important, because that's also where you can learn about what's working, what's not working.
Great, thank you. The next question here, does the reforestation projects have to be in the billions before it's considered a reforestation project? And what is the minimum land mass for such a project?
I don't think there has to be a minimum land mass. I think there should be reforestation in each of our backyards if we have the capacity and it's the right place and it's the right tree and it's the right community. So let's use inclusive reforestation.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think that there's no minimum size. Of course, with a smaller area, your goals are much more modest. But you can also join up a lot of small areas together later and make a much bigger whole out of that. So I think starting small should not be viewed as a poor way to do reforestation.
In fact, one of the projects we funded is a handbook for perennial vegetable tree crop species for Turtle Island and so-called US, so that folks could actually have more capability to grow, replace food crops that would be secured from monocrop organic or monocrop farming, to grow your own food in your backyard through perennial tree crops. So just put that in there as well.
And I'll just add, for journalists, like don't fall into the trap of only wanting to cover projects that are big, because I think smaller projects are in some ways more interesting, have more, and you can learn more from, and you can, they can be just as newsworthy as a large project. So don't discriminate based on size. Look at the small projects. Focus on what the details are more interesting than the size. And small projects can be definitely worthy of coverage as a big project.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And I've been writing case studies together with my partner, Sarah Wilson, and we've discovered that some of the smaller ones have provided just huge inspiration and resources for much larger scale work in the regions that could not have been done without the experience of these small projects. So the small pioneers are the ones who are providing the resources for scaling up many of these activities.
I want to go ahead and get to this next question here. It's really quite important. So this person says, reforestation in Nigeria is largely misplaced due to corruption. Millions of dollars budget for tree planting ends up in the pockets of individuals, but our forests have been largely destroyed by woodmakers, charcoal productions, and the bombing of forests due to insurgency. As a journalist, what do we do in reporting this kind of story without getting picked up by the government?
I do not know. I would ask that question back to you, and I would really want to know how I or we could support you in that type of context and situation. I would really trust you to know best the level of safety and security in reporting that kind of story. And I imagine there are a number of actions that the global community could take to support a more safe place for media and truth and coverage to take place. And so please, I'll put my email in the chat and contact info. You can contact me on LinkedIn, but let's support each other in this work.
Yeah, I guess I can't speak to the specific conditions in Nigeria, but I can say there's a lot of information you can get, especially if you're investigating corruption and financial streams, and through desk research, which may be more feasible. I would also say I would be interested if there's like an international connection, or is there international finance or supply chains flowing to or from Nigeria or to or from these companies or these actors? And is there a potential for international collaboration? And maybe that's a way to be able to report the story from a different angle that can give it some global attention, make it a, so I think I can't speak to the local safety concerns, but I think it's an interesting, important story, and it should be hopefully be reported on. I think these things are not just happening just in Nigeria. I think there's a lot of corruption in the forestry sector all around the world, and a lot of safety and security concerns as well.
All right, so we've got time for one more question here that I just saw that I think is really good here. Countries have made a lot of pledges about conserving forests and restoring landscapes between now and 2030 or 2050. So what are your thoughts about following up on those pledges? How can journalists be watchdogs about the use of that money?
That's a really great question. There are efforts to do better tracking. For example, there's the Restoration Barometer that IUCN is organizing, and that's largely to keep track of bond challenge commitments, but other things as well. And I think the more that the journalism community begins probing, the more pressure that will put on a lot of organizations to be more transparent and to take more seriously regularized updating of these activities and documentation of activities. I think the pressure that it's really good to have pressure from journalists. I know as a scientist, I'm always trying to probe and get information, including from the case studies. And sometimes you really get the feeling that it's not there, that, it's just, a picture someone took, and that's the evidence that they did the restoration work. So you've got to ask the questions, and the more people that are asking, I think the more pressure that will put on getting the right information out there.
Yeah, definitely. It's really challenging because it's hard to get real-time data. These projects take a long time to take place, and these goals are set in the future. But I would be skeptical about what the government says and promises. I know in Indonesia, there's been cases where the government is including plantations as forest cover in their figures. So look into the figures, make sure there's not things hiding there that shouldn't be hiding there, and hold them accountable. And be sure to use the new resources out there, like Resource Watch, the Global Forest Monitor. There's a lot of new tools out there that can help you kind of independently analyze whether what the government is telling or what they're promising or actually what is related to what's taking place on the ground. So that'd be my piece of advice. And we need more people to do it as well, because there's a lot of projects and a lot of countries and a lot of commitments, and there's not enough journalists reporting on it right now, unfortunately. So I hope we can see a lot more, because as Robin said, we need to hold people accountable, and we need to be able to verify what's going on the ground.
I don't have anything to add.
All right. Well, that is about all the time we have today. So I just wanted to say, on behalf of Mongabay, I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their expertise and their wisdom. Thank you so much. And to our audience for joining us. As always, we hope these live events inform the work you do, and is going to give you a better understanding of the environmental topics that we and other environmental outlets cover. So I've had a lot of questions regarding whether or not the information in the chat is going to be saved, and whether or not all these resources will be saved. They will. This will be posted to YouTube. And you will receive a follow-up email with links to these resources. So just as with our last webinar, if you need to reference it into the future, it'll be on YouTube. So please make sure to follow us on that channel and subscribe. And we'll also be publishing a link to the video on our blog at mongabay.org. And if you have any ideas you'd like to pitch to us, you can do so at our opportunities page, which is also at mongabay.org. Just scroll down and click Reforestation. And while there, sign up for our occasional email newsletter, which shares new paid reporting opportunities as well as job openings here at Mongabay. So thank you all so much for making this webinar a success. And I'd just like to mention that Mongabay's webinar series will also be featuring topics on carbon offsets, illegal wildlife trafficking and data journalism this year. So make sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn because we'll be posting announcements and updates in advance of each of those webinars. So thank you so much for joining us, everybody, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you so much, Mike. I just want to say a big gratitude to Mongabay for the impressive reporting and coverage of these important issues and the nuance that you take in really covering community-based issues that often don't make the headlines and don't get covered anywhere else. And so I really appreciate the incredible journalism. And I really appreciate also all the participants and attendees for being considerate to think about these issues in a more complex, nuanced way. And if there's anything I can do to support you or you have further questions, feel free to reach out to me. And I learned a lot from Robin and Nithin as well today.
Yes, thank you so much as well. And I also learned a lot and really enjoyed hearing all the questions and answering and discussing the issues. And I think I do want to help those journalists who need to tell these important stories. So also, if there's anything that I can do on my end to help you, let me know.
Great. It was an honor to be on the panel with both of you. I learned so much from you two, and I will take advantage of both of you in the future as I hope to do more reporting on this on reforestation. And thanks, Mongabay, for being a great platform for high quality environmental journalism that's really needed and being a place where we can cover these important stories.